Arguably the most enduring and accessible game of all time. From behind the Iron Curtain, same name, different game, Tetris. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration right here on Same Name Different Game. This is our second Tengen focused episode of that series. Last time we talked about Ms. Pac-Man and how it came in both licensed and unlicensed varieties on the NES. And this episode we'll be talking about one of the most interesting stories in the history of video games. So let's get started once again, not with a little history, but with a lot of history. Starting with an overview of how Tetris made its way out of the USSR and into continental Europe, the US, and Japan. In 1984, a young man named Alexei Pajitnov was working in the computer center of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Pajitnov had a love of puzzles, with his favorite being pentominoes, a puzzle that gives you several pieces made from 5 squares that you have to fit into a large rectangle with no wasted space. Using this as an inspiration, he created a computer game using tetrominoes, pieces made from 4 squares, falling into a rectangular well that's 10 squares wide and 20 squares high. The game was originally developed for the Electronika 60, a Soviet terminal computer that couldn't display any graphics besides text, so the original game was made using only text. A short time later, the computer center got an IBM compatible, and 2 of Pajitnov's co-workers ported the game for him. And this is important, arguably the most important part of the story, because while nobody outside of Mother Russia was using the Electronika 60, IBM compatibles were everywhere by the mid-80s. And it was in this form that the game started to spread. It was copied and copied and copied. People would show it to their friends and they invariably would love it and ask for a copy, and the cycle would repeat. The game made its way out of Moscow into the rest of the USSR and eventually into outlying Eastern Bloc countries. The game eventually landed in Hungary, where it was discovered by a man named Robert Stein. Stein was the owner and operator of Andromeda Software. Andromeda's business model was to license games from Eastern Europe, then take them to the UK and either sub-license them to larger publishers or simply publish them himself. When he saw Tetris, he knew he had to have it. Stein contacted Alexei Pajitnov himself by fax and eventually found himself with what he believed to be the rights to Tetris, lock, stock, and barrel. He sub-licensed the game to Mirrorsoft, a subsidiary of the Maxwell Corporation. Mirrorsoft in turn sent it to their American subsidiary Spectrum Holobyte for release in the United States. And here's where things get troublesome. Look, this part of the story is super interesting, but it's not the focus of this episode, so I'm gonna kind of nutshell it for you. But if you want more details, I highly recommend checking out a BBC documentary called Tetris, From Russia with Love. Mirrorsoft licensed an arcade version to Atari Games, who, as we know, owned Tengen. Hank Rogers, who operated a software company in Hawaii, saw Tetris at a trade show. He immediately sought out the rights to make it for the Famicom, getting a sub-license from Atari Games, and began selling the game in Japan. Nintendo approached him because they wanted it for the Game Boy's impending launch. Rogers tried to broker a deal through Stein, but Stein wasn't returning his calls. Rogers decided to go to Moscow himself, and on the same day, Hank Rogers, Robert Stein, and Kevin Maxwell, heir to the Maxwell Empire, were all in Moscow and saw Nikolai Belikov in separate meetings. Belikov is the man at Elorg, the division of the Soviet state responsible for software exports. It turns out Stein had not been paying what he owed the Soviets. So when Rogers went in for his meeting, he showed Belikov the Famicom cart, and Belikov told him it was illegal because Elorg has not granted the rights to anyone for anything besides home computers. Long story short, Hank Rogers leaves Moscow with the exclusive, worldwide, handheld, and console rights to Tetris. Needless to say, this is a big problem for Atari Games, and it's also where we meet our first game for this episode. The Tengen version of Tetris, released on the NES in mid-1989. As far as Atari Games and Tengen were concerned, they had the rights to Tetris. But as far as Nintendo was concerned, they had the rights to Tetris, so they sued. Now, recall that, as we covered in the previous episode, there was already bad blood here. Tengen was in the process of suing Nintendo for unfair business practice and had already stolen the patent for the 10 NES lockout chip, although no one outside of Tengen knew that yet. Unfortunately, the law is on Nintendo's side in this one. It all goes back to Robert Stein, who sold licenses he didn't own. The paperwork from Elorg is presented in a US courtroom, as strange as that sounds, and the judge finds in favor of Nintendo. Atari is forced to recall hundreds of thousands of Tetris carts less than a month after it hit the market. They say about 100,000 made it out into the wild, although I've heard unconfirmed reports that in the years since, about a decade after the original launch, some dead stock was found and increased the numbers of these that you can find out in the market. Meanwhile, Nintendo creates their own Tetris. Their main goal was Tetris on the Game Boy. It's the game that's packed in with the Game Boy when it launches, and it's the perfect game for it. But Hank Rogers also secured the console rights for Nintendo, so why not put those to use as well? They did, and in late 1989, we got this. It's important to mention that at their core, both games are Tetris. They're the same. The set of blocks is the same. The well is 10 squares wide and 20 squares high. Looking at them, of course, we see the blocks are shaded differently, the music tracks are also different, and it does merit saying that neither contain Korobeniki, the old Russian folk song that is now known as the Tetris music. That song was first featured on the Game Boy version, but not in either NES version. There are a few notable differences though, and I'll just get the biggest one out of the way right now. 2-player. For a long time, the Tengen version was sought out almost entirely because it contained not one, but two-player modes. A competitive and cooperative mode are both featured. The Nintendo-developed version is a strictly single-player affair, but it does contain 2 modes as well. Mode A sees the player simply going as long as they can, clearing lines until the inevitable series of mistakes that sees a piece go over the top of the well, ending the game. Truly though, there are 3 things in life that are certain: death, taxes, and you will eventually lose at Tetris. Mode B gives the player the task of clearing 25 lines with adjustable speed and height of pre-existing bricks. These factors both create score multipliers, and once you clear the required 25 lines, you get a little animated scene. The greater your score, the more Nintendo characters are present. For all intents and purposes, the Tengen version only contains one single-player mode, the equivalent of Mode A, create lines until you lose. But after creating so many, you get a little break, and the higher your score between going up levels, the more little dancers come out on the intermission screen. Now, at this point, you may be asking, why would I want to seek out either one of these games? And I would say you're probably right. There's probably not a reason to. I mean, you can get Tetris on your phone for like $1. But there are a couple of things that these older Tetris games do not have that newer Tetrises do. First and foremost, in modern Tetris games, there is what is known as infinite spin. What this means is that if you keep spinning a block while it's touching other blocks or the bottom of the well, you can keep moving it left and right as long as you continue spinning it. Many hardcore Tetris devotees call shenanigans on this, and, well, if you're among them, note that neither NES version allows this. The second is the bag. The bag, also known as the random generator, is a system that makes sure you get one of each tetromino every 7 pieces. That is, it's as if all 7 of the tetrominoes are put in a bag and drawn out one at a time, and when the bag is empty, it's refilled and the 7 pieces come out again in a new random order. Now this wasn't implemented until years later, so again, the NES games do not have it. This is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, the math involved with the size of the well and the bag means that you literally must lose eventually. I know earlier I said death, taxes, and losing at Tetris, but hypothetically in Tetris games before the bag, you could theoretically keep a game going indefinitely, because there's nothing preventing you from getting any block at any time. The problem, of course, is that you will often get several S or Z blocks in a row without the reprieve of the I or T blocks. So while the lack of the bag can, again, theoretically mean infinite Tetris, it more often means that games come to a much quicker end due to a dearth of good pieces. The final thing is the shadow. All current incarnations of Tetris show you where your block will land if you drop it straight down. This is very helpful. Neither NES version does this. So if you really want a reason to seek either one of these out, there's a couple for you. Now let's go ahead and compare the graphics and the sound, like we do. In my opinion, the Nintendo developed one looks and sounds just a little better, but like I said, that's just my opinion. It's a close race. And that makes it time to give the edge. So if it's NES Tetris that you're after, the Tengen one kind of wins it by default because, again, 2 players. Although if you're playing solo, I suppose you couldn't be faulted for playing the Nintendo-developed version, just because, as I said, I think it looks and sounds just a smidge better. So that normally would be the end of the show, but we've got a few loose ends to tie up. Let's get back to that story of Nintendo and Tengen and see how that turned out. With Tetris taken from them, Tengen fought even harder against Nintendo, but it wasn't enough. Essentially, in 1991, the Copyright Office reached out to the court, informing them that they believed Atari Games had procured a copy of the patent for the 10NES chip by nefarious means. And in 1992, the Federal Circuit Court upheld an injunction preventing the sale of Tengen's unlicensed games, citing the unclean hands doctrine. What this means is that since Tengen had acquired the code in the 10NES chip by stealing a copy of the patent, well, you know.
You get nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
Meanwhile, the suit Atari Games had filed against Nintendo for unfair business practices limped onward. That case had gotten extremely dirty, with Nintendo counterclaiming that Atari Games had violated the RICO Act. The RICO Act is the act that the FBI used to take down John Gotti and the Mafia in the 1980s. Eventually, the case was settled out of court, with Judge Fern Smith of the District Court of Northern California dismissing the case with prejudice, meaning that neither party could refile this case. The details of the settlement are sealed and, as of this date, have never been released to the public. The likely reason for the settlement was that in 1993, controlling interest of Atari Games had once again come under what was then known as Time Warner. And Time Warner probably didn't want to continue any sort of litigation with industry giant Nintendo, so they settled, and Atari Games was right back where they started, with Warner as their parent company. They were folded into the Time Warner Interactive division of the company, but it wasn't long before they were spun off once again as Warner lost interest in video games, and they ended up with WMS, the parent company of arcade giants Williams and Midway. It was in 1998 that WMS spun off all of their video game business into a separate company simply called Midway. And in 2009, unfortunately, Midway went out of business. And when they did, most of their intellectual property, including everything that was done by Atari Games, ended up with, wait for it, Warner Brothers. It's the circle of life, and it moves us all. And Tetris? Well, that story has a happier ending. Alexei Pajitnov created the game under a communist regime and as such made no money off of it until the rights reverted to him in 1996, long after the Berlin Wall came down. At that time, he and Hank Rogers formed the Tetris Company, which to this day oversees the rights to Tetris all over the world, as well as providing guidelines for what has to go into any officially licensed Tetris game. Things like the bag that we talked about earlier, for example. Well, that does it for this episode, but come back next month, because the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration, it's not over. And we'll be looking at an NES classic, along with its Famicom counterpart, as we get ready for a same name, different game Halloween special. We'll see you then. Thanks for watching.
You need a Tetris shop.
Tetris.
Have you been Tetrisized?
Square, rectangle, trapezoid, tetrazoid.
Nintendo introduces Tetris.
Put a piece here, put a piece there. Use your thumbs, use your eyes. Find yourself Tetrisized.
Now you're playing with